They say the Harrow place still creaks at night, even though no one has lived there for nearly 40 years. The boards sigh the way a body does when something heavy presses down on it, and the wind that cuts through those broken windows doesn't howl, it moans, almost like it remembers. Folks who pass by swear they hear a woman whispering on the porch, humming a lullaby no mother should ever sing. Around here, they don't speak her name loudly. They only murmur it, as if saying it too clearly might wake her. Eliza. The woman whose sins didn't just stain her family, they reshaped it. Long before the stories twisted into the nightmares they are now, Eliza Harrow lived at the edge of the swamp, far from the town lights and even farther from the world's sense of right and wrong. Her family had been strange for generations, quiet, pale people who kept to themselves and locked their gates long before sundown. But Eliza was different. There was something in the way she watched people, as though she was studying them, memorizing their softness, their warmth, their freedom, things she had never been given. And when the boy named Jacob arrived, the one everyone said was her cousin's son, the Harrow property seemed to change. The air grew still. Birds stopped nesting in the trees. The swamp water thickened, darkened, as if reacting to something it had seen before. Jacob was only 15 when he came to live with them. Too young to understand the undercurrent running through that old house, too soft to resist its pull. People in town said he used to stand at the edge of the Harrow fence, staring out like a trapped animal, as though he wanted to leave but couldn't. And Eliza, always silent, always watching, seemed to follow him everywhere, her bare feet whispering across the wooden floors behind him. Some swore they saw them walking together at twilight, their silhouettes merging into one as the sun bled out behind the trees. When the first animal carcasses showed up near the Harrow well, people talked. When the second batch appeared, they prayed. But it wasn't until the night the lanterns glowed upstairs in the Harrow attic, long after Jacob vanished from the town completely, that the whispers became fear. Because Eliza didn't come out for months after that. And when she finally did, carrying a swaddled bundle to the midwife's door in the middle of the night, the old woman fainted at the sight of what lay in her arms. No one knows exactly what was born in that house. But whatever it wasn't just a child. It was the closing chapter in a bloodline that never should have existed, and the beginning of a legend Mississippi would spend decades trying to bury. The rumor didn't return suddenly. It crept back the way old ghosts do in small southern towns, slow at first, drifting between porch conversations and late-night front-yard whispers, then gathering weight as more people remembered pieces they had tried to forget. It began with an old man at the gas station who, after seeing the Harrow property mentioned in a land survey, muttered that the place should have been burned down decades ago. Someone overheard him, repeated it to a friend, and within days the name Eliza Harrow was passing through the community like a chill breeze that settled under the skin. Folks who had grown up hearing fragments of the tale started to recall details they once brushed aside, as if memory itself was being pulled back to life by something unseen. A few swore they had never believed the stories, but their voices always dropped when they said so, as though fear still lingered beneath their doubt. Soon, the rumor grew sharper. People began to talk about strange cries they claimed to have heard near the old Harrowland at night, even though no one lived within miles of it. Hunters mentioned seeing shadows that didn't match any animal they knew, moving too deliberately to be tricks of the moonlight. The local pastor, who normally dismissed superstition, subtly advised parents to keep their children indoors after dark. He wouldn't explain why, and that silence only fueled the talk further. What had been a half-forgotten legend was becoming something newly alive in a way that made the air feel thick, like the town itself was remembering alongside the people. A newspaper archivist searching through old records for a genealogy project found references to a sealed case connected to the Harrow family. Dates didn't match, names were crossed out, and whole pages seemed to have been removed years earlier, leaving only shadows of what once had been documented. She didn't open the file, but the sight of those scratch marks and missing entries lingered with her. When she mentioned it to a coworker in what she thought was a harmless conversation, the rumor took on a sharper, more dangerous tone. Suddenly there were murmurs about things the Harrows had done, things better left buried, things that made even the boldest men avoid the isolated dirt road leading to the swamp where the family once lived. People who had stayed silent for years started sharing their own fragments of memory, stories their parents once whispered, warnings their grandparents passed down, odd events that never fit neatly into any explanation. And as each piece resurfaced, it felt less like the town was uncovering a rumor and more like the rumor was uncovering the town, peeling back its layers to reveal something they had all tried to ignore for far too long. The diary wasn't found in a chest or neatly stored on a shelf. It surfaced the way cursed things do, by accident and in the hands of someone who had no idea what they were touching. A contractor named Willis Grant had been tearing down the remains of an old tool shed on the far edge of the Harrow property, a structure so rotted that even raccoons avoided nesting in it. When he kicked aside a warped plank, the ground beneath it collapsed just enough to reveal a hollow space. Inside lay a small, leather-bound book wrapped in what looked like an old flour sack, its edges darkened by moisture and time. Willis might have ignored it, he wasn't the curious type, but the moment he touched the diary, a strange unease prickled the back of his neck, as though something in the air shifted, urging him to leave it where it had been hidden for decades. But he didn't. He wiped off the dirt, flipped it open, and discovered delicate handwriting filling every page, written in ink that had browned but remained hauntingly legible. The first few entries seemed ordinary, noting daily chores, weather patterns, and family matters. But as Willis read further, his chest tightened. The entries mentioned rituals of blood, family instructions repeated like commandments, and phrases that didn't belong in any normal life. By the time he realized whose diary he was reading, his hands had begun to shake. The name Harrow appeared on almost every page, but one particular signature sent a cold rush through him. Margaret Harrow, Eliza's grandmother, a woman town elders once described as the root of everything wrong with that family. Willis didn't keep the diary for long. He didn't sleep that night, hearing rustling outside his window and imagining shapes moving beyond the tree line. At dawn, he delivered the diary to the local historical society, claiming the place had bad air and refusing to return to the property. The archivist, curious and far braver than him, began examining the diary properly. As she translated the looping, old-fashioned script, she realized the entries were not simple musings, they were warnings, confessions, and sometimes pleas. Margaret had written about strange births, about a belief that their bloodline held purity that must never be diluted, and about the terrible cost of maintaining such a belief. She mentioned children who were not right, secrets hidden beneath floorboards, and a promise she made to her daughter, who would later make the same promise to Eliza. As word of the diary spread quietly through the community, people sensed that the old rumors were no longer just stories. The diary was not folklore or town gossip, it was evidence, written by a hand that trembled across the pages, revealing a lineage twisted long before Eliza ever took her first breath. Eliza's upbringing was unlike anything a child should ever know, shaped not by affection or guidance but by the tight, suffocating grip of family doctrine passed down like a hereditary curse. From the time she could walk, she was kept inside the decaying Harrow home, a place where the windows were always shuttered, and the hallways smelled of old wood and loneliness. Her mother, a severe woman with eyes that never softened, taught her that the outside world was dangerous, filled with people who sought to corrupt the Harrow blood. Her father rarely spoke at all, drifting through the house like a ghost whose only purpose was to enforce silence. The rules were strict, almost ritualistic. Eliza was not allowed to play with other children, not allowed to wander the swamp alone, not allowed to ask questions about the strange symbols carved into the house beams or the locked room at the end of the upper hallway where whispers sometimes slipped through the cracks at night. Meals were eaten in silence. Books were chosen for her old, brittle volumes about ancestry, natural order, and obedience. Every lesson pointed in the same direction. The Harrow blood was special, and its preservation was her duty. She didn't understand what that meant, not fully, but the weight of expectation pressed down on her even when she was too young to give it a name. At night, she often heard her parents arguing in hushed, urgent tones about continuity and responsibility, their voices trembling as though they were speaking of something sacred and terrible. Sometimes she heard crying, her mother's or her own, she couldn't tell, but it was always quickly swallowed by the oppressive quiet that filled the house again. The only glimpses she ever got of a normal childhood came when she stared out through the slats of the boarded windows and watched the distant shapes of other children running along the road. She never waved, never tapped the glass, but something inside her ached as she watched them, something her family had not managed to suffocate entirely. But whenever her mother caught her watching, the woman would pull her away with a grip tight enough to bruise, reminding her that the outside world carried danger, sickness, and corruption. Her mother's voice always cracked when she said those words, as though fear lived inside her throat. Eliza grew up believing that closeness to anyone outside the family was betrayal. The Harrows warned her that outsiders judged, ruined, diluted. She was taught that her destiny was already chosen, that love, longing, and independence were luxuries people like her could never afford. By the time she reached adolescence, the isolation had carved itself into her bones. She moved softly, spoke rarely, and obeyed without question, shaped entirely by a family that had built its own world, a world where bloodline mattered more than humanity, and she had no idea how deeply it would shape the horrors still to come. Jacob's arrival at the Harrow home did not feel like the entrance of a new family member, it felt like the house itself exhaled after holding its breath for years, as if anticipating something it had been built to contain. He was only 15, thin from grief and travel, and still dazed from losing both parents in a sudden tragedy that no neighbor could quite explain. The official story was that a fire had taken them, but people whispered about strange circumstances, about how the flames burned too hot and too fast, leaving almost nothing behind. Jacob had no one else, or at least that was what the Harrows insisted when they brought him back to the ancestral property. Whether this was an act of charity or something far more calculated became clearer with time. When Jacob stepped inside the house for the first time, the quiet nearly swallowed him. He was used to noise, to movement, to the ordinary chaos of life, and the Harrow home's stillness pressed against him like a physical weight. Eliza watched him from the staircase landing, her expression unreadable. Jacob offered her a small, polite smile, but she only stared, as though studying him the way one studies an unfamiliar animal. That was the first moment he felt uneasy, though he pushed the feeling aside, believing it to be nothing more than grief tightening around him like a cold hand. The Harrows welcomed him in their own unsettling way. Eliza's mother placed a hand on his shoulder and told him he was safe now, her voice too soft and too practiced. Her father simply nodded, his eyes lingering on Jacob in a way that made the boy shift uncomfortably. They gave him a room at the end of the hall across from the locked door Eliza had grown up fearing, telling him it was the most appropriate place for him. Jacob didn't understand what that meant, but he noticed how Eliza's mother avoided looking directly at the door when she said it. At first, Eliza kept her distance. She appeared in doorways without sound, watching Jacob with an intensity that frightened him. When he tried to speak with her, she answered in brief, clipped words, as though language itself was foreign to her. Yet despite her coldness, Jacob felt a strange pull toward her, a mixture of curiosity and loneliness, both sharpened by the oppressive atmosphere of the house. She moved through the halls like a shadow given shape, always silent, always aware, and Jacob sensed that she understood the place and the people in it in ways he never could. But it didn't take long for him to notice that the Harrows treated him not as a child in need, but as something expected, something essential to a plan that existed long before his parents died. The longer he stayed, the clearer it became that his arrival was not a coincidence at all, but the beginning of a design woven through the family's darkest intentions, one that would eventually entangle him and Eliza in ways neither fully understood. It happened quietly at first, subtle enough that townsfolk only mentioned it in passing, unsure whether it was worth noting. But in a place where people paid attention to patterns, even the smallest shift stirred unease. The first whispers began when a farmer driving home at dusk noticed Jacob and Eliza walking along the edge of the pine woods, their figures half swallowed by the failing light. They weren't talking, weren't laughing, weren't even moving with the casual rhythm of two young relatives out for a stroll. Instead, they walked slowly, side by side yet strangely apart, as if obeying a rule neither had spoken aloud. The farmer said the sight chilled him because they didn't look like children, they looked like two shadows mimicking the shape of people. Within a week, others claimed to have seen them, always at twilight, always drifting toward the swamp as if drawn by something waiting beneath the dark water. A woman driving back from the church potluck swore she saw Jacob try to turn away, only for Eliza to catch his wrist with a grip too firm, her expression blank and unreadable as she guided him deeper into the trees. Another man said he caught a glimpse of them standing beside the old cypress stump, Jacob staring at the ground while Eliza watched him with an intensity that made the man accelerate his truck without thinking. No one could say exactly what was wrong about the pair, but everyone agreed that something about the way they moved together felt unnatural. The whispers grew louder when children playing near the road told their parents that Eliza had stepped out of the woods and stared at them without blinking until they ran home crying. They mentioned Jacob too, but only to say he stood behind her, looking pale and frightened, as though he wanted to speak but couldn't. Parents brushed it off at first. Children exaggerate, after all, but when 3 separate families reported similar encounters, unease began settling over the community like a low fog. The Harrows had always been strange, but this was different. This was unsettling in a way people felt but couldn't describe. What troubled everyone most was the look Jacob wore. People who saw him said he seemed thinner, quieter, as though something inside him was dimming. He stopped waving at neighbors. Stopped smiling. Stopped lingering at the fence as if hoping someone might talk to him. Meanwhile, Eliza only grew more watchful. She lingered closer to him each time they were seen, as though guarding him or claiming him. It didn't take long for the town to interpret their twilight walks as something more than innocent wandering. The Harrows were notorious for secrecy, and the sight of those 2 young figures disappearing into the woods at the same hour every evening began to weave itself into a narrative no one wanted to admit but everyone secretly believed. In a place where rumors grew like vines, the idea that something forbidden was forming between Eliza and Jacob took root quickly, tightening around the town's collective imagination until even those who didn't believe in curses started locking their doors before nightfall. The first animal showed up in late autumn, lying stiff beside the Harrow well with no wound to explain why it had died. It was a fox, its fur sleek and body unmarked, eyes open as though it had seen something that stopped its heart. A hunter heading through the property found it and hurried away without touching it, muttering later in town that the creature looked wrong, though he couldn't explain how. Most people dismissed it as coincidence. Animals die in the woods all the time. But then came the second one, a deer this time, collapsed in the clearing behind the house, its legs twisted as if it had fallen mid-run. No blood. No tracks. No reason. The Harrows offered no explanation. They simply dragged the carcass into the barn and shut the doors, leaving neighbors to their eyes in hushed tones. Then more animals appeared, 3 dogs from neighboring farms, 2 raccoons, and a wild turkey, all found near the Harrow property line, all lifeless without a single mark on them. The pattern was impossible to ignore. People began to avoid the area, claiming the woods felt heavier, quieter, as if something unseen had settled there. Even the birds stopped gathering in the cypress trees, their songs abruptly absent. Every morning seemed to bring another carcass, another unanswered question, another reason to keep away. The sheriff visited once, surveying the scene with unease. He suggested poison, though he found no evidence of it. When he tried to speak to Eliza's father, the man stood on the porch with a calmness that made the sheriff's skin prick. "The land takes back what it wants," he said simply, refusing to allow further inspection. Many believed the strange deaths had something to do with Eliza and Jacob, who by then were seen together almost daily, drifting through the woods as if in a trance. Some swore the animals died after the pair walked near them, though no one could prove this. Others whispered that the Harrow blood carried a curse, one that had begun to uncoil, reaching beyond the family and touching the land itself. Parents forbade their children from playing anywhere near the property. Farmers began walking the long way around, even if it added miles to their route. No one wanted to take chances. Rumors took on a darker tone when Mrs. Langley, who lived closest to the Harrows, reported hearing a strange sound late at night, something between a whimper and a shriek, coming from the woods behind her house. She claimed she saw flickering lantern light near the Harrow barn, shadows moving inside as though someone was performing a ritual. Others dismissed her as dramatic, but then she found a dead possum at the edge of her yard the next morning, positioned almost deliberately, its body arranged facing the Harrow home. By this point, fear had begun to outgrow curiosity. The idea that something unnatural was happening, something tied to the family's dark legacy, became the unspoken truth everyone silently accepted. And as the animals continued to fall, the town felt the walls of the old Harrow curse closing in, one death at a time. When Eliza became pregnant, the Harrow house shifted in a way the townspeople couldn't see but could somehow feel in the air, as though something long hidden had finally stirred awake. The Harrows had always been private to the point of suspicion, but once the family realized Eliza was carrying a child, secrecy hardened into something far more controlled, almost militant. The windows were covered with new boards, thick and freshly nailed. Curtains that once hung loosely were replaced with heavy, opaque fabric that blocked even the sharpest daylight. No one saw Eliza outside anymore. The soft glimpses of her at dusk, wandering through the trees with Jacob, became memories swallowed by silence. It was as if the house had swallowed her whole. Inside, the atmosphere grew thick and stifling. Eliza's mother took complete control, monitoring every corner of the house, locking doors, double-checking latches, moving with a frantic purpose that betrayed her calm exterior. She kept Eliza upstairs, insisting she needed rest, though the harshness in her tone suggested something else: fear, maybe, or desperation. Eliza's pregnancy wasn't treated like a blessing but like a fragile, volatile secret that needed constant guarding. Her father patrolled the property at night, lantern in hand, muttering to himself as he walked the boundary line. Neighbors who lived miles away could see that faint, flickering light weaving through the trees like a restless spirit. Jacob disappeared from public view as well. People assumed he was in the house, but no one saw him, and no one dared to check. Some whispered that he had been forced into isolation with Eliza, while others believed he was being kept away from her entirely. A few even feared he had met some darker fate within those walls. The Harrows did nothing to ease those suspicions. Every time someone approached the property, whether a concerned church member or the sheriff returning for follow-up questions, they were met at the gate by Eliza's father, who stood firm and unyielding, saying that the family needed privacy and would not tolerate intrusion. The few sounds that drifted from the house only deepened the unease. Late at night, neighbors along the distant road reported hearing muffled cries, not loud enough to interpret but strained enough to haunt their thoughts. Sometimes it sounded like Eliza sobbing. Other times, like whispers layered on top of each other, frantic and urgent. One neighbor claimed she heard chanting, soft, rhythmic, unnatural, but no one wanted to believe her, not out loud. And then came the night someone noticed smoke rising from the Harrow chimney for the first time in years, thick and black and smelling of something foul, almost chemical. It burned for hours before finally thinning into the early morning sky. After that, no one saw movement in the windows again. The house went still, eerily still, as if bracing for what was coming. The townspeople didn't know the details, but they sensed the truth instinctively. Whatever was happening inside that house was not ordinary, not natural, and it was only a matter of time before the full horror of it reached the outside world. The midwife came in the middle of a storm, summoned not by courtesy or request but by a sharp, frantic pounding on her door just after midnight. She was an old woman, hardened by decades of bringing children into the world, yet even she felt her blood chill when she saw Eliza's father standing on her porch, soaked through and wild-eyed. He didn't ask for help, he demanded it, gripping her arm with a force that left bruises. The midwife didn't argue. Something in his expression told her refusal was not an option. She gathered her supplies and followed him through the storm, the wind howling around them as though trying to warn her away. Every step closer to the Harrow home made her chest tighten, an instinctive dread rising from a place deeper than reason. When they entered the house, the air felt wrong, thick with heat and tension, carrying a metallic smell that reminded her of old blood and damp wood. Eliza's mother appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale and strained, her eyes wide with something that looked more like fear than urgency. She led the midwife into the upper room where Eliza lay on a narrow bed, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, her breathing shallow and uneven. She looked far too fragile to survive what was coming. But the thing that unsettled the midwife most was Eliza's expression, not pained, not panicked, but distant, as though she was slipping somewhere far away, trying to escape her own body. The labor was wrong from the beginning. The contractions came too close together, too violent, shaking Eliza's thin frame as if something inside her was fighting its way out rather than being born. The midwife had delivered difficult births before, but nothing like this. The air grew hotter, the shadows on the walls seemed to shift, and every time she touched Eliza's stomach, she felt movement that didn't match any rhythm she had ever known. Eliza's mother hovered beside the bed, murmuring something under her breath, words not meant for comfort but for control, as if trying to command the child inside her daughter. Hours passed, each one heavier than the last. When the moment finally came, the midwife braced herself, expecting screams, chaos, something familiar. Instead, everything went quiet. The wind outside stilled. The room seemed to shrink. And what emerged into her trembling hands was not what she had prepared for. The midwife took one look, just one, and her breath vanished entirely. She staggered back, dropping her cloth, her eyes wide with a terror she could not hide. Eliza's mother snatched the infant away before the midwife could speak, wrapping it tightly and whispering fiercely, as though afraid silence might let something slip through. The midwife didn't wait for permission to leave. She grabbed her bag and fled the house, stumbling down the stairs, her heart pounding with a fear she had never known in all her years. She didn't look back. She didn't speak of what she saw. By morning, she had packed her belongings and left town forever, leaving behind only a single trembling statement to the sheriff: no child should ever be born like that, and no family should ever raise one. Jacob's disappearance was as sudden as it was chilling, leaving the town awash in whispers and unease. One morning, the neighbors noticed the absence first. The boy who had always lingered near the edge of the Harrow property was gone, nowhere to be seen among the twisted pines or along the narrow dirt roads that cut through the swamp. His room remained untouched, his belongings in their exact places, yet the bed was empty and unmade, as if he had evaporated into thin air. People speculated endlessly, but no one dared approach the house to ask. The Harrows, who had always moved with a calm, predatory precision, offered no explanation. They seemed almost unaffected by his absence, though those who glimpsed them noticed a tension in the air, a rigidness that suggested they were aware of something the rest of the town could only guess at. It was several days before anyone dared venture closer, prompted by the smell of faint, metallic tang drifting faintly from the Harrow attic. Neighbors whispered about hearing the faintest sound of splintering wood late at night, like something scraping or clawing from the upper floors. Some claimed they had glimpsed a shadow moving behind the windows, indistinct but unmistakably human, vanishing the instant they blinked. The sheriff, reluctant yet compelled by fear and duty, finally made his way up the winding path. He entered the house with a heavy sense of dread, every step creaking under his weight, and the darkness inside seemed to thicken around him, pressing against his skin as though alive. When he reached the attic, the scene froze him. There, on the rough wooden floorboards, lay a small trail of blood, not a puddle but enough to suggest violence, a struggle, or a ritual performed with precision. There were no footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing except the blood leading to the far corner where Jacob had vanished completely. The sheriff could feel it instinctively. This was not an ordinary disappearance. He called for help, but by the time the reinforcements arrived, the blood had begun to darken and blend with the aged wood, almost erasing itself, leaving only the faintest trace of what had occurred. The Harrows offered their standard silence, merely watching as the lawmen retreated, powerless and unnerved. Rumors spiraled immediately. Some claimed Jacob had been taken by the swamp itself, a punishment for his proximity to the Harrow family's twisted designs. Others whispered that Eliza, whose presence was still constant yet distant, had somehow claimed him for her own secret purposes, an act of control no outsider could comprehend. Whatever had happened, the disappearance was a turning point. It confirmed the deepest fears that had been building around the Harrow property. The town became quieter, more cautious, its residents whispering in shadows. Jacob's absence was not just a missing boy, it was a tangible sign that the Harrow legacy had begun to extend beyond isolation and secrecy, reaching into reality in a way both horrifying and undeniable, leaving a mark on the community that could not be erased. Eliza's child survived, but the way it arrived into the world was unlike anything anyone could have imagined, and the aftermath only deepened the shadow that had long hung over the Harrow family. In the days after the birth, the midwife's warnings and the neighbors' whispered fears began to crystallize into a story that no one could easily dismiss. The infant was not merely fragile, it carried with it the weight of unnatural lineage, a presence that made the air in the room heavy, almost electric. Eliza herself moved differently, quieter than ever, her eyes carrying a hollow awareness as if she had glimpsed something forbidden and could never forget it. The child's cries were not the normal, sharp protests of a newborn but something jagged and unsettling, cutting through the stillness of the house and echoing in the dreams of anyone who happened to pass nearby. The Harrows treated the child with a reverence and fear usually reserved for sacred relics. Its existence was a confirmation of everything the family had believed about bloodlines and purity, yet it was also a tangible, undeniable threat to anyone outside their walls. The neighbors began reporting strange phenomena, crows gathering in unusual numbers, livestock acting skittish without cause, and a persistent feeling of being watched when passing the property. The house, long decayed and silent, seemed to pulse with life, a presence that emanated from within and reached outward into the surrounding land. Townsfolk who glimpsed the child through windows or from a distance described a face that was strangely familiar yet alien, a fragile form that seemed too small and too deliberate in its movements. Fear and superstition spread quickly, amplifying the Harrow legend. Families refused to allow their children near the swamp or the property, and even adults walked the long way around, leaving the roads near the house eerily empty at night. Every misfortune, every illness, every unexplainable event in the vicinity was quietly attributed to the Harrow bloodline, as though the child had become a focal point for all the town's latent dread. Conversations that once skirted the edges of rumor now spoke openly of curses, of unnatural births, and of a family whose sins had rippled into the world in ways no one could reverse. Within the Harrow home, the family's obsession intensified. Eliza's mother hovered constantly, guarding the child as if it were both treasure and threat. Eliza herself alternated between distant detachment and protective intensity, her maternal instinct tangled with a sense of inevitability that the child would inherit more than just physical traits. The house, the land, and even the people in proximity seemed to acknowledge the child's power and danger, as if the Harrow lineage had produced not merely a descendant but a force that could not be ignored. Over time, the child became the anchor of a story that would outlive everyone who had ever seen it, cementing the Harrow family's name in the whispers and shadows of Mississippi folklore as a lineage both cursed and unbroken, a living testament to a legacy that should have ended long ago.